Nearly two-thirds of companies believe that Quality 4.0 will transform their operations in the next 5 years, but less than 20% have started that work. 63% haven't even reached the planning stage. Larry, in your own words, how would you define Quality 4.0 for people who are not familiar?
Yeah, I think if we step back and think about it more broadly, the ultimate goal of Quality 4.0 is to leverage advanced technologies, empower people, optimize the processes people work in to deliver exceptional results. The problem is Industry 4.0 was really all about identifying technologies and implementing them with the thought that it would go across the manufacturing facility and the rest of the business. And I think the tip of the spear was the manufacturing facilities technologies, but the intention was always that where, regardless of how the technologies get implemented, or if you consider that Industry 4.0, the content, the data was supposed to be managed by this concept of digitizing for Quality 4.0. So it's digitizing the technology and taking it all the way to the reporting, review, and monitoring of that information for business leaders to use.
Does the role of quality professionals, quality leadership, a quality organization change from 3.0 to 4.0?
Yes, uh, especially in the life sciences business. I've spoken to you about the fact that I think quality is focused too much on compliance. Quality is sequestered with a certain group of processes, more specifically associated with regulation. Then there's a couple of those pre-programmed processes in old QMS systems that cut across the organization, like training or dock control. But for the most part, there's so many processes that make up the system that an organization uses to deliver its products or services. And the vast majority of those are left outside of this quality realm. So I think the need and intention for Quality 4.0 is that it does cut across the entirety of the business and that we do unlock the power of quality, little q, to make the business perform better.
And so that's an interesting distinction you made. You've done work in both pharma, medical device, and you've also done work at CROs, and you've seen life sciences in a way that I think more people tend to just stay in one. And so you notice that cultural difference?
Some businesses, this comes from my interactions with an individual who was in the FDA, is back in private industry, but prior to going into the FDA, he was in electronics. If you take electronics or automotive, they leverage quality across, and that's because they needed to in order to optimize the business operations so that they could remain profitable. So in some industries, quality is highly leveraged. In other industries, quality is not as highly leveraged. So yes, I think it's time for an awakening. It's time for the business to recognize that quality could be a deciding factor in their profitability. Some people think it's blasphemous to speak of finance and profit when you're talking about quality, but it's not. What good is it for a business to be fully compliant if you're not even profitable?
In terms of actual implementation, have you seen any companies that are done with implementing Quality 4.0?
No. What's interesting, there might be somebody out there, a private entity might have already figured it out, a public business, private entity. But when you step back to look for the roadmap, and that's what I did. At some point, I was reading a lot about people, process, and technology. We're talking about leveraging technology to empower people to optimize process. There it is, people, process, and technology. And that's what I developed everything around. It required this digitization component. But if you jump straight to that, you don't get a great result. You can't automate a process that's not well defined. There's a lot of other things you have to peel apart to understand the process. The companies out there that might be successful would be the ones that fully understand that they have to have a strategic approach. That strategic approach has to be considering all stakeholders, especially the workforce, because it impacts the workforce. And so there's a communication element, there's a programmatic element. And I'm not saying companies haven't done it, but I'm saying there's just a bigger picture than saying stick in that technology and pull that data using an API or something. It's so much more advanced than that and so much more holistic than that. And that's why I think looking at it from a big Q perspective expanded to better manage the little Q of the business is really important. When I searched for people who have the roadmap, who have facilitated it, I found there was no answer. There was no roadmap. Matter of fact, the Quality Management Journal from Q1 of 2024 said it doesn't exist. And the more I looked for it, I realized it didn't. I knew that I had built digitization in as something that is addressed after the process is modified at the process level, modernized, and all the information that is the book of work about the process is taken out and understood. And from an engineering perspective, it's locking down a degree of freedom. The next part is the execution of it, the people's mindset. You can't just say, we're going to go here and turn people over there and say, just do it. You have to prepare the organization to say, you're no longer working in a procedural based process. We're going to flip the paradigm. So you're going to work in
Yeah,
a
yeah.
business process workflow that happens to have procedures and other artifacts that support it. So it's getting them to think all work is process. I work in a process, and that's really important. You got to shift the culture to that.
So as far as the digitization piece, are you saying that the workflow should be flagged for digitization before you outline any procedure? In other words, you would go to software requirements and flow of the process flow diagram and map out whatever tool you're using and then say this is the procedure?
Actually, I'm
Okay.
thinking more broadly than that. As I said
Let's
earlier,
let's go through an example. Let's say you have a process. You have an event, something happens, you need to enter it into the system, or we can do a complaint process. How do you take that and move to 4.0?
so I'm glad you brought up legacy QMS, and I'll use a complaints process because I actually have an example that I like to use. It's built out, and I can show people if they're interested. There's a very well known legacy EQMS pre programmed complaint process. One of the companies I work for had a very unique product that involved it's a combination product, but it involves cold chain shipment. It involves cold chain storage, going to a radio pharmacy to be charged to be radioactive. It involves being sent to a healthcare facility. There's a lot of players in that complaint process flow. The company was really behind in processing complaints because of all the complexity that is truly there. And so, to a legacy QMS, two things. One, the process flow that's built into there was not built by quality professionals creating best demonstrated practice. It was built by software companies who might have hired quality people who say this is the best demonstrated practice, but in truth, it's best demonstrated practice to sell the most. Then you say, well, can I customize it? Yeah, but it's a lot of expense in pre-programming. So the answer is go from a pre-programmed legacy system to a modern era drag and drop process builder. What you're implementing is something called a digital twin. What it means, very simply, is I can mimic the actual process, and I don't care what process it is in the company. I can start from scratch and I can build that process. The analogy I've used before is a clothesline, and you're hanging shirts. Each shirt along the clothesline is a step in the process, and the clothespins are the SIPOC in between. So you've got sequence and interaction between these steps, which are internal customers and our internal suppliers and external customers. And there's requirements and information about that trade-off. That step was done well. In a lot of cases, you can build at those junctions or within the process step itself. You can actually use technology to do things. You can build automations. So when I talk about a digital twin, it's a place to put an automation, place to put a trained AI model. More importantly, and especially in between those process steps, It's a place to have requirements and the ability to put a control to extract data. It could be timestamp. It could be that a requirement was met and your internal customer accepted that you did your work and they're going to do theirs now. So you're building this digital twin that when people are working inside of the digital twin, they can even communicate. There are different solutions out there. Some have communication tools built in, some co opt your company's email system, but everything gets documented within that system. The difference between a pre-programmed solution is people just go in, enter stuff, and hit enter. They're still doing their work outside of that system and hanging stuff in it like objective evidence versus working inside of the process. And the process is live because of the digital twin. The clock doesn't stop ticking on your step until somebody accepts your output as their input and so on. Building the digital twin is one thing. If you think of Industry 4.0, that is installing the digital capability. As I said earlier, digital technologies are well established in a manufacturing environment, but not so well established inside of everything besides manufacturing. So we have these old hangover systems that are really outdated now. If people could go to a digital twin process builder technology, they can start to do many more things than they could ever do. One last comment. It's all about the data, right? It's all about getting to this concept of management controls. I just talked about the digital capability of taking a technology and looking at strategic investments and talent development around that organizational transformation to using those technologies, but they create the information that we need. So the next part is you step back from that one process and you get back to this concept of what are we trying to do? What is the objective and how do we measure it? And you put that together and you work back and you pull data, not just from that digital twin, but it could be data that comes from, if you're working in a complaints process, from the manufacturing of that lot and lot information. Anywhere you see the need to pull data to make sense of what's going on. So it's being able to have digital continuity all the way through to your reports, your review information, your data, your dashboards, your monitoring, and even more important is sustaining that digital continuity. So it consists of establishing a digital twin for the technologies you have strategically decided to invest in for that process, establishing digital capability, establishing from what you want to pull from to understand that process and establishing objectives and key results that are built from KPIs, which each of those points of information are, key performance indicators built into OKRs. So you can have management control. So you could see and understand against the objective or the key result you're looking for, how are we doing? You're giving people relevant information within which they can manage the part of the business that they need to manage or make decisions that they need to make.
How important is it to have a thought out roadmap around how Quality 4.0 is going to be implemented in an organization? Philip Crosby, in his book Quality is Free, which you introduced me to in the first episode I recorded, he has this maturity grid that you start with uncertainty and get to certainty. There's a whole roadmap about how you go from A to B, but he also says you need to start with a pilot process and then build from there. How important is it to have a roadmap?
I think it's very important because the concept of expanding the role of quality to manage little q quality is huge. At the strategic level, you need to communicate the entirety of what I just spoke about to the organization. It's nothing new. It's this concept of changing the culture, of change management. You have to communicate to stakeholders at the highest level in the organization. They have to get behind it. You have to communicate to the most important stakeholders, if you ask me, people who would really adopt it is the workforce. And we talk all the time about workforce culture. If you want to transform a workforce, and I'll give you an example, there are companies out there that measure their employees who work remotely or even in an office setting. They have software to see who's tickling their keyboards. What you really want are people to be invested in the business. I've said this to you before, I've written about it. The three things people need, and I didn't make this up, I've cited it in other places, but the three things people need are career, community, and cause. So the reason they came to the company wasn't because that was the best company in the world, because not all others were maybe even entertaining them. They're taking this role in this business. They need the money for their family, and that's what we all do. But once in, they're looking for a community. And that community includes leadership. If the leadership can't explain in a big, broad picture, here's what we do and here's how we do it, do you think they're going to be inspired? Not really. How about the community if they're working in a process? And I think of that complaints process where everybody that when we were doing the work to unpeel it and put it back together and create that book of work, they argued about what was in the process flow, yet they all worked in it. Once we were done, they were all one community working in a process. They were a team. So getting people involved. And what were they after? In that case, the cause happened to be the objective of improved complaint investigation. We put boundaries, timeliness, and first time through, things like that. When people can see what role they have in a process that fits in a system of processes, that's how this business is run. That's all tied to road mapping. That's all tied to leaders explaining how do we run the business and how is it executed so that people can say, I can get on board with that. It's huge. And I think this shift might take decades, but I want to be one of the people that challenges how fast it can be adopted. Here's a path forward. Crosby wasn't wrong about modeling. You don't say we're doing this across the organization. You explain where you want to go. It's in an early phase. You start it, you get an internal example so that people can see it. This work with our business. Where are we going next? And then the big picture should be, well, all of our core processes that deliver products or services to the market, I don't care if it's in manufacturing or if it's somebody releasing product or doing whatever they do. If we don't do it, the customers don't get product or service. That's got to be addressed. And I would get all of that under my first wave under Quality 4.0. Then after that, you move to what are the processes that directly support that? But if they shut down today, we wouldn't be shut down, but we're going to have to address it soon or we will be. That would be what I would call key support processes or critical support, whatever you want to call it. Then there's indirect support. Some of them are those compliance processes. So, for example, doc control. You should have I shouldn't say gotta, you should have a document control process that everybody understands and utilizes to sustain the standard work of the business. But if it shut down, how long could you go before you had to rebuild it? If you think of quarter to quarter profitability, that's one level, but at a strategic level, you also have to think of, okay, now we know we can go quarter to quarter and what does it take to grow? And that means you have to understand the big picture. You have to be able to target constraint. If I want to go into a new market, if I want to grow the current market and invest in that, will our operations keep up? And if the answer is no, but here are your constraints and how far you have to move, that's helpful because now you can run a yearly program that you've invested in to move the needle. You can tell the organization, here's where we are today, here's where we're going tomorrow. You keep the heart of your business, the people, part of the bigger community. You keep them engaged. That's the one thing that gets lost when we talk about technology, empowering people and making them a core of what the business does. That also means we're doing it for them and keeping them informed. The leaders have to almost take a subservient view of the organization that they are trying to manage and improve. They can have the best plan in the world, but without the people behind it, because they never communicated that and had a roadmap to do so, you get lost in the minutia, you lose your people too. Long-winded answer, but that's, I think, important.
No, with 4.0 coming to a head on the coattails of Industry 4.0, Quality 4.0, that is. I'm maybe drawing a parallel that doesn't exist, but just as an illustration, I remember when the combination product regulations were legislated in the 2013 timeframe. And then I remember in 2014, all of a sudden, everybody started becoming a combination product expert. And I'm like, how can you really be an expert on something that just came out? Quality 4.0, it's a new name to something that people were already doing, right? How do you distinguish between somebody who can actually help implement Quality 4.0 versus somebody who's paying lip service to a new concept? There are these topics that come up, and it's easy to say you're an expert in something that just started.
Let me give you
Yeah.
an example, a personal example. I can talk freely about it, but it's an example of how I became aware. First of all, I want to disclose that one of my partners in my business had been my son, who has a business degree. He is a programmer. He has data analytics expertise. Another partner, the business has shifted. We had a software that we developed, and this other partner had created a way to scrape post-market data available from the FDA using Quality 3.0 techniques. It was all manual, put together, but it was able to come up with a way to understand from the post-market medical device patient safety data what was tied to a new standard, the 14971 2019 risk management, the state-of-the-art benefit of patient safety. And again, that's that a level of when you put a product out, level of harm or potential harm that could be caused to a patient that exist inherently in any device. Q-tips have a level of harm. So if you're in a pump business and your pump has a failure mode that would say cause death or injury that other pumps weren't, they were having failure modes that were just causing a device malfunction that wasn't really associated with harm. The competitive company causing death or injury must lower their safety profile to the level of their competitors. That's the concept of the state of the art benefit. Now, getting back to Quality 4.0, we had a partner to create the software. They decided not to create an API interface to get the same information that the agency gets from the sources they use. Instead, it was let's for free use the agency's data. Why not? It's provided from the agency. We can teach companies just use the agency's data. We have a tool. The problem is when COVID rolled around, that stopped. Using a roadmap to create digital capability, we didn't plan for digital continuity. Sometimes people learn by experience. We had fleshed it out to comparative analytics, the management control, and we're able to get it down to telling a business of all of your pro codes. These are the ones that have products that have failure modes that cause harm, and that we can go in and actually isolate the failure mode, look at the control or absence of, and improve that. So stepping back, looking at the business holistically, I think your question is how do people become experts? Companies who might have done it on their own might have brought in people. And if they didn't have a big picture view, they might go right down this path of Industry 4.0 and that was it. Or keep the workforce out of it and we're doing this and everybody's going to follow it. So I think the word expertise might be early. I'd love to think that the solution I developed, and I didn't develop it necessarily with Quality 4.0 in mind, but this 5 phases framework was developed more with that big picture understanding, the totality of my career. So I approached it with real world experience that might be considered expertise, but I'll say it's more of a first step toward the solution. You and I have had conversations about standing on the shoulders of giants. I don't go to look for creating something new. I go to utilizing, or in your words, combining. I'm a ComBinate guy, combining proven solutions. If it's an expertise, it's more holistic at this point. When you get into some specific aspect, like when I talked about digital continuity, that's a structured approach to developing, implementing, and maintaining digital continuity across the organization levels. But when you talk about digital capability, that's that actually strategic look at every process and what goes there. So you have to bring in multiple skill sets to do that. I would never call myself an expert in this stuff. I would always leverage other people and other expertise. But at this leadership level, it's going to take a broad view and a broad understanding of how it's going to help the business. And at the end of the day, that's why I talk about operational excellence in terms of efficiently effective operations, because regardless of the business, efficiently effective operations and management control over those operations are what's going to make the difference. So are there experts end to end? No. In terms of being able to dive in and go all the way down to the minutia? No. But are there people out there like me who can say, I can help you create a strategy. And then if you want to take the framework that was created and make it better, go ahead. I would love to see that. But right now, nothing exists. I just put out a press release saying, I have all the components. It does exist. And I'm hopeful that it is something I don't have to spend my career watching it come to fruition, because I want to see quality accelerate. I want to see quality management accelerate. I want to see companies using, such as in electronics and automotive, using quality as a decided advantage. And I think that's what the gurus, Deming and others, Crosby, Stewart, with his statistical quality control and things like that. I want to see us leverage that stuff, putting it all together and building upon it. And I don't want it to take decades before somebody out there says, I have all the answers. I don't think it's at that level. I think it's so much broader. Companies have to start. It begins with exploring. It begins with looking at their current strategy. Here's the problem. A lot of times companies don't start until they're in trouble. They might have a backlog of something or things that have to be remediated, not just necessarily from FDA findings, but it could be other things that are just hampering the business. They have to run a remediation. You can't hit a moving target. Their business is experiencing profitability downturn. That means they have to be able to look at their business from a turnaround perspective, the traditional levers. But I would caution, don't just get rid of people, because people cost. And we're going to go to automation and quality 4.0 because people are at the heart of that. If you do downsize, it has to be in a predictable manner within a quality 4.0 initiative. If businesses rethink that bigger approach to using quality and start with a model, you're not beginning with sweeping, we're changing everything. You start by informing your leadership team that we have a plan that we can take 3 steps forward, maybe even 4, but we're going to model it. And so through that, they learn, understand, and become empowered to transform the organization, not just run it because that's what they've done for the last 40 years. So I just think it's a bigger picture, and the old traditional styles of management where you bring in someone who's been there, done that. I hate to say it, and I'm going to say it with my gray beard. It's not always the people that have been there and done that that can make this change in a new quality 4.0 environment, unless, as I was, because of the partners I had, they were willing to open their eyes and see things that I couldn't see, but my partners could show me. So if they can find a partner out there that can help them see a bigger picture and understand how to model it and make sense of it for their business, that's what's going to drive it.
I've been part of initiatives where a quote unquote expert is brought in and you're talking to them and they can feel out of touch. They philosophize. They're not into the weeds anymore. They haven't been, and they're used to their word being taken at face value at the highest level possible. And they're
Yeah.
not into the details, which makes it difficult to collaborate with them if you're in the weeds of a process and you're just like, it's going to take me a while to explain this to you and you don't even want to listen. The second part that I find even more frustrating is that a lot of problems that organizations, companies, even products have are solved problems. Like when you were talking about the quality 4.0 implementation and the introduction of the digital twin and all of that, like you were talking about SIPOC, a very basic concept
Yeah.
from Six Sigma, I believe, is SIPOC, right?
Yep.
Um, and so all of these tools and frameworks exist. The digital component is a little bit newer, but how you get there and build it out is not new.
Right.
Even something like SPC, companies are not doing that. Moving on.
Let me just make one quick comment tied to the digital component being newer. Digitizing it is newer, but in that framework, it's a plan, do, check, act framework. Once you get
Right.
past your strategy, the check used to be scraping data, putting together reports, putting together management reviews. So digitizing that is just the concept of the digital aspect, but what's underlying it, we're not changing anything. We're using best demonstrated practice and just making it, when I talk about empowering people or empowering a leadership team or empowering the people that work in the process to understand how their work is going, how the process is, how well it's built, how well they're executing it. So I'll leave it there. It's plan, do, check, act, and other tools. It's nothing new under the sun, just at a different level.
So how does quantum quality fit in with quality 4.0?
Quantum quality, when you and I were, you've seen it evolve since we started speaking. I used to call it predictive quality management, but there came a point where I started to recognize this concept. I started seeing the word quantum a lot, and I looked it up. It's a physics term. It means to get the most reaction out of the least combination of elements. And I thought, that's interesting. It's not to make this big, convoluted system that nobody can understand and only external people can help you with. It's to deliver a solution that is built upon doing the least to get the most. So I rebranded it, changed the name. QQM is actually pretty straightforward. I put an article in LinkedIn and it describes it well, tied to 4.0. It's 5 phases. Now, modernize, energize, and digitize, that's the plan, do, check. By building the capability to not have to scrape data, to be able to pull that information. That's done over and over for every single process in your business. You don't do it all at once. There has to be a way that you finance it and plan for it and pay for it. So the strategy in the beginning is, do we understand what's S&OP, sales and operations planning? Most companies will say, yes, we do S&OP, but when they look at sales, that's simple. Here's the revenue we could bring in. When you look at the operational side, if you just look at the costs, but you don't ask, do we have the capability and the capacity? You can fail, and it happens often. So it's looking at your business, where it is today and where you want to go tomorrow, and being able to do the quarterly investment as well as the yearly investment. So that's the strategy part. It's tied to communication and other important things. Then let's say we've modernized our processes. We've re-energized people to work in those processes, understand their responsibilities and all the requirements. They become a part of the business by doing so, and they work within a community. So there's career, community, and cause. The third, the digitization, well, that's where it does get murky. People don't need to understand it. They just have to understand that we're going to put everything in a digital twin. We're going to take new tools to help you do your work and optimize the process. We're going to be able to apply digital continuity to extract information across the organization that tells us how the system is working. And so that's what people need to know at that level. I actually think our digitization might be the furthest along because of the work that I've done, because it gets into, what do you do with that data? Are you just taking KPIs? Some companies don't understand the difference between KPIs and OKRs. That's okay. Just tell us what your objectives are. Tell us what you want as a key result. We'll build that for you. In essence, with the end in mind, understanding what a dashboard looks like, understanding what needs to be reported to interim management. Reporting has to be scalable. Management control comes from what is the human constraint. Digitization helps that human constraint at all levels, but you have to have a strategy to build it out at all levels. This gets to the optimization, which is actually quality management, the act of quality management. It's targeting constraint. It's understanding, not making it perfect. I've heard that before. You have to eliminate all non-conformance. No, that would mean we eliminate variation, and nobody can do that. It's identifying what variation is causing the failure that we don't like, reducing it to a level that's acceptable, and controlling it thereafter. So management control comes in many different forms, but it begins with that understanding of what's our constraint that we have to target, but you're always doing it to the benefit of the business. That's the big picture with the QQM framework that I've developed. You can see what it looks like at a high level, and anyone who wants me to bore them to death or know more, I'm happy to talk to people. We talked earlier about that communication. When we first spoke, I had tons of content and we were down in the minutia of the how. And I've learned, and that came out of roadmap to get there. And that came out of the mind mapping exercises and understanding how each of these parts should be divided and what's the clarity with between them and within them.
Where can people find you, Larry?
The easiest way to find me right now is on LinkedIn. Our website is being rebuilt, so hit me up on LinkedIn and let's talk.